The knock on the door came at midnight, and Alina Vance knew before she opened it that something was wrong. She had been awake anyway, sitting by a dying candle with a letter in her hands that she had already read 4 times. The letter was from the 4th household in a row that had turned her away. No reason given, no explanation needed. Her name was enough. The knock came again, harder this time. She opened the door to find a boy from the coach house, out of breath, his coat soaked from the rain. "They need someone who can read," he said. "Tonight. Now. The ship from Lisbon is stuck at the harbor and nobody can make sense of the papers." Alina did not ask questions. She grabbed her cloak and followed him into the storm. The road to Wren Hollow Harbor was thick with mud, and the wind pulled at her cloak like it wanted to keep her from arriving. When she reached the docks, she found chaos. Men shouting over each other, lanterns swinging wildly in the wind. A ship anchored just outside the harbor wall, refusing to come closer, its captain shouting something in Portuguese that nobody on shore could answer. A tall man stood at the center of it all, his coat dark with rain, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise without being raised. This was Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Wren Hollow, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days. "You," he said, turning to Alina before anyone introduced her. "Can you read Portuguese?" "Yes." "Then read this." He shoved a soaked paper into her hands. "Before that ship turns around and takes my cargo to another port." Alina scanned the page under the lantern light. Her eyes moved fast. The captain was refusing to dock because he believed the harbor fees had doubled without warning, a mistake buried in a mistranslated clause from an earlier contract. She looked up. "He thinks you're trying to cheat him. He's wrong. It's a translation error, not a trick. Someone changed the wording without changing the numbers." "Fix it," Julian said. "Now." She did not have paper of her own, so she used the back of an old shipping manifest and wrote quickly, translating the correction into clean Portuguese while the wind tried to tear the page from her hands. A dock worker wrote it out to the ship. 10 minutes passed. Then the ship's lanterns shifted, and it began moving toward the harbor. Julian watched it come in, then looked at Alina like he was seeing her for the first time. "Who are you?" "Nobody important," she said. "I was told to come read papers. I read papers." "You saved £4,000 of cargo tonight." "You're welcome," she said, and turned to leave, because that was what she always did after proving herself. She left before anyone could remember to ask about her name. "Wait," Julian said. She stopped. "I need someone who can read, not just Portuguese, everything. French, Spanish, Dutch, German, Ottoman, Turkish, Danish, Italian. My correspondence is drowning me. My last translator quit 2 months ago and I have contracts sitting unread that could ruin this estate." Alina turned back slowly. "I speak 7 languages. I have references, though I doubt you'll want them once you hear my name." "I don't care about your name. I care whether you can read a contract without setting my harbor on fire." For the first time in months, Alina allowed herself to hope. "My name is Alina Vance," she said, watching his face for the flicker of recognition that always came next, the one that ended every interview before it began. It did not come. Julian only nodded once, sharp and businesslike. "Start tomorrow, 6 in the morning, my study." He turned and walked back toward the harbor to deal with the unloading, leaving Alina standing in the rain, soaked through, holding a job she had not expected to survive the night to find. She did not know yet that the contract she had just corrected was not a simple mistake. Someone inside the estate had changed those numbers on purpose, and whoever they were, they had not expected anyone to catch it in time. The next morning, Alina arrived at Ashcombe Manor before the sun had fully risen. A young steward named Peter Lang met her at the servants' entrance, looking at her with open suspicion. "You're the one from last night," he said, "the translator." "That's right." His Grace doesn't usually hire people so quickly. Peter's eyes moved over her plain traveling dress, her worn boots, the small case she carried with her few belongings. Where are you from? Copenhagen originally, then Lisbon, then wherever my father's work took us. And your father was? Alina felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came before every conversation like this. A diplomat. He is no longer living. Peter did not push further, though something in his expression told her the questions were not finished, only postponed. He led her through the manor's back halls, past a kitchen full of early risers who glanced up and then quickly looked away, and into a study lined floor to ceiling with untouched correspondence. The room looked like a battlefield. Letters piled on the desk, on the chairs, on the floor near the window. Some were opened and abandoned halfway through. Others were still sealed, months old by the look of the wax. Julian was already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee he had clearly forgotten to drink, because it had gone cold in his hand. "This is everything?" Alina asked, stepping into the room. "This is everything from the last 4 months. There's more in the shipping office." 4 months. She picked up a letter near the top of a pile, checked the seal, and set it back down. "Your Grace, some of these could contain instructions with deadlines, cargo releases, payment terms." "I'm aware." "Then why has nobody been reading them?" Julian finally turned from the window. His face was tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Because my last translator resigned without warning, and every person I hired after her lasted less than a week." "Why?" "Ask them. I don't know. I only know my shipping partners in 3 countries think I've gone silent, and silence in trade looks like weakness, and weakness invites people to take advantage." Alina set down her case and rolled up her sleeves. "Then let's stop being silent." She began sorting the letters by language first, then by date, moving through the stacks with a speed that made Peter, who had lingered in the doorway, raise his eyebrows. Within an hour she had organized 4 months of chaos into 6 neat piles, and within 2 hours she had read through the most urgent ones and begun drafting replies in Julian's voice, a voice she was learning quickly from the handful of his own letters mixed into the pile. Julian watched her work for a long while before he spoke again. "You work faster than anyone I've employed." "I've had practice. My father moved often. I learned to read a room and a document quickly because we rarely stayed anywhere long enough for slow habits." "Why did you move so often?" Alina's pen paused for half a second over the page, then continued. "His work required it." It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either, and something in the careful way she said it told Julian not to ask further. He had learned in his years running the estate when a locked door was meant to stay locked. By midday, Alina had cleared through nearly half the backlog. She found 3 contracts with deadlines that had already passed, each one requiring an apologetic letter and a renegotiated term. She found a Danish shipping partner who had sent 2 increasingly frustrated letters demanding payment for goods already delivered. She found, tucked near the bottom of one pile, a letter written in careful, deliberate French that did not match the tone of any business correspondence she had seen so far. It was a warning. The letter was unsigned, written in a hand that seemed to be disguising itself, and it said only this: "The numbers on the Lisbon contract are not a mistake. Someone inside your house wants your trade routes to fail. Watch who benefits when your ships are turned away." Alina read it twice, then folded it carefully and did not mention it yet. She wanted to understand more before she brought suspicion into a house that had only just begun to trust her. That evening, as the light faded and Peter came to collect the tea tray, Julian finally sat down across from Alina's desk instead of standing at the window. "You've done more today than the last 3 translators combined," he said. "I've barely started." "No, you've started. That's more than they managed." He studied her for a moment. "Where did you learn 7 languages?" "Necessity, mostly. My father believed a diplomat's daughter should never need an interpreter of her own. He taught me himself. In whatever port we happened to be living in that year. And your mother? She died when I was young. I don't remember much of her voice, only that she used to hum while she cooked, in a language I never learned because there was no one left to teach me. Julian did not offer sympathy, which Alina appreciated more than she expected. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he understands that some doors are not meant to be pushed open on the first day. You'll stay in the East Wing, he said instead. Mrs. Doyle will show you the room. Start again tomorrow at 6. Yes, Your Grace. Julian is fine in this room. I don't have the patience for titles when we're both drowning in paperwork. It was the smallest kindness, but Alina felt it land somewhere she had not expected. She had been offered rooms before, jobs before, careful politeness before. She had never quite been offered a first name. That night, alone in the small East Wing room Mrs. Doyle had shown her, Alina took out the unsigned French letter again and read it a third time. Someone inside this house wanted the Duke's trade routes to fail. She thought of the mistranslated clause on the Lisbon contract, the one she had corrected in the rain. A translation error, she had told Julian. But translation errors did not usually change numbers so precisely, in a way that benefited nobody unless it was designed to cause exactly the kind of chaos she had witnessed at the harbor. She folded the letter and placed it beneath a loose floorboard she had noticed near the window, a habit left over from a childhood where hiding things quickly had sometimes mattered more than she wanted to admit. Whoever had written that warning knew something, and whoever had changed those numbers on the Lisbon contract was still inside this house, walking these halls, perhaps passing her in the corridor with a polite smile that hid something else entirely. Alina Vance had come to Wren Hollow, looking for nothing more than a place to work without being turned away at the door. She had not expected to walk into the middle of something far more dangerous. But she did not leave. She had run from enough houses already. This time, she decided, she would stay and find out exactly who wanted the Duke to fail and why they were willing to risk 4,000 pounds of cargo and possibly more to make it happen. Outside her window, the rain had finally stopped, but somewhere in the manor, a door closed softly in the dark, and Alina could not be certain whether it was only the wind. 3 weeks passed, and Alina had cleared the entire backlog of correspondence. The study that once looked like a battlefield now held neat rows of answered letters, organized ledgers, and a working system that even Peter Lang admitted was better than anything the estate had seen in years. But the unsigned French letter stayed hidden beneath the floorboard, and Alina had not stopped thinking about it. She had begun watching the household carefully, though she was careful not to look like she was watching. She noted who came and went from the study when she was not there. She noted who asked too many questions about the shipping contracts and who never asked any questions at all, which was its own kind of suspicious. There was Charles Gray, Julian's cousin, who visited the estate often and always seemed to know more about the shipping schedules than a guest should. He was pleasant to Alina's face, always polite, always smiling in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. There was Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, who ran the household with quiet efficiency and had no obvious reason to want the estate to fail, since her own position depended on its success. And there was Peter Lang, who had access to every letter that came and went, and who had been oddly cold to Alina since her first day, though she could not decide whether that coldness meant anything at all. One morning, Julian called her into the study earlier than usual. He looked troubled, a letter open in his hand. "Read this," he said, passing it to her. "Tell me if I'm imagining things." It was written in Dutch, from a trading partner in Amsterdam, and it echoed something Alina had feared since she found the warning letter. The Amsterdam partner wrote that a rival shipping company had approached them with strange knowledge of Wren Hollow's private contract terms, terms that should have been known only within the estate. Someone is leaking your contracts, Alina said quietly. That's what I thought too, but who? Everyone who touches these letters is someone I trust. Alina hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded French letter she had kept hidden for 3 weeks. I found this on my first day, buried near the bottom of the pile. I didn't show it to you because I wanted to understand more before I brought suspicion into your house without proof. Julian read it, his jaw tightening with every line. The Lisbon contract, that wasn't a mistake. No, I believe someone changed it on purpose. Hopping the ship would turn away and the cargo would be lost or delayed long enough to damage your standing with other trading partners. Who would do that? I don't know yet, but whoever wrote this warning knew enough to be afraid of saying it openly. That tells me they're inside this house, and they're afraid of being caught alongside whoever they're warning you about. Julian sat back, running a hand through his hair. For a long moment he said nothing, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into an answer. My father built this trade network over 30 years, he said finally. Every partner, every route, every agreement negotiated one conversation at a time. If someone inside my own house is trying to tear it apart, I need to know who, and I need to know why before it costs me everything he built. Then let me help you find them. He looked up at her, surprised. You've already done more than your position requires. I don't think this is only about your position anymore, Julian. If someone is leaking contracts to a rival company, they may not stop at damaging your trade. They may see me as a threat too, since I'm the one who caught the first mistake. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked briefly like concern before he covered it with the calm, businesslike tone he used for everything. Then we'll be careful, both of us. Over the following days, Alina began cross-referencing every letter that left the estate against the schedule of visitors and staff who had access to the study. She built a quiet record, hidden in her own shorthand, of who was present on which days, and which contracts had gone missing or been delayed around those same dates. A pattern began to form. Charles Gray had visited the estate on 4 separate occasions in the last 2 months. Each visit lined up, within a day or two, with a leaked detail reaching one of Julian's competitors. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to make Alina's pulse quicken every time she heard his voice in the hallway. She decided to test her theory carefully. During Charles's next visit, Alina made sure to leave a single false detail on her desk, a fabricated shipping date for a cargo that did not actually exist, written on a scrap of paper where anyone passing through the study might glimpse it if they were looking closely enough. 3 days later, a letter arrived from a rival trading house in Bristol, inquiring about a shipment that matched the false date exactly. Alina's hands trembled slightly as she read it, not from fear, but from the sharp, cold satisfaction of being right about something dangerous. She brought the letter straight to Julian. "It's him," she said. "Charles Gray. I left a false detail where only someone visiting the study would see it, and 3 days later that exact false detail appeared in a rival's letter." Julian read it twice, his face darkening. "My own cousin." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You found what my own household staff couldn't or wouldn't." He set the letter down carefully, his hand steady despite the anger Alina could see building behind his eyes. Why would he do this? He inherits nothing if the estate fails. If anything, he loses his own place in this family's standing. "Unless he doesn't want the estate to fail completely," Alina said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "Unless he wants it weakened enough that you need help managing it. Help that only he can provide if he positions himself as the one who steps in when things go wrong." Julian's expression turned grim. "He's been suggesting for months that I take on a partner to manage the shipping side of things, someone with, in his words, a steadier hand." His hand. His hand. The pieces settled into place with an unpleasant clarity. Charles Gray was not trying to destroy the estate. He was trying to make it fail just enough that Julian would be forced to hand over control, quietly, without ever suspecting the man who orchestrated the crisis was the same man offering to solve it. "We can't accuse him without more proof," Julian said. "Not yet. He'll deny everything, and without solid evidence, I'll only look paranoid to the rest of the family. Then we build the proof carefully. I can continue watching the correspondence. If he's careless once, he'll be careless again. And if he realizes you're the one watching him." Aliner met his eyes. "Then I suppose I'll have made an enemy who already has a habit of undermining people quietly, from a distance, without ever getting his own hands marked." Julian did not look reassured by that, and Aliner understood why. She was not entirely reassured herself. That night, as she prepared to leave the study, Peter Lang appeared in the doorway, holding a small package that had arrived by courier. "This came for you," he said, his voice carrying its usual coolness. "No return address." Aliner took the package carefully, feeling a strange weight in her chest as she turned it over in her hands. She waited until Peter had gone before opening it. Inside was a single folded note, and beneath it, a small piece of jewelry, a brooch shaped like a compass rose, tarnished with age. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her father, sold years ago to cover the cost of a hurried departure from a city they had needed to leave quickly. The note was short, written in the same careful, disguising hand as the first warning letter. "You are asking the right questions. Be careful who you ask them near. Not everyone in that house wants the truth found. Some only want it buried where you found it." Aliner read the note 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. Someone was watching her progress. Someone who had access to a piece of jewelry she had believed lost forever, which meant they had access to information about her past that went far beyond the walls of Wren Hollow. Whoever had sent the first warning was not a stranger to the estate. They knew things about Aliner that no one at Wren Hollow should have known. She thought immediately of the rumor that had followed her from house to house, the one that had closed 4 doors before this one opened. She had assumed it was simple gossip, cruel but ordinary, the kind of thing that followed any woman whose family history included scandal. But if someone connected to this estate knew enough about her past to send her father's brooch as proof of their knowledge, then perhaps the rumor was not ordinary at all. Perhaps it had been planted. She sat with that thought long into the night, the compass rose brooch resting in her palm, its tarnished surface catching what little candlelight remained in the room. Somewhere in this house, or connected to it, someone had been watching her long before she ever arrived at the harbor in the rain. The question that kept her awake was not only who, but why. Why would anyone go to such lengths to track a translator with no fortune, no family connections left to speak of, and nothing to offer beyond 7 languages and a sharp memory for detail? Unless the answer was simpler and more frightening than she wanted to admit. Unless the leaked contracts and the rumor that followed her were not 2 separate problems at all, but 2 threads of the exact same plan, one designed to weaken the Duke's trade routes, while the other was designed to make sure the one person capable of catching the sabotage never lasted long enough in any household to notice it. Aliner placed the brooch beneath the same loose floorboard where she had hidden the first letter, her hand steady now, her mind sharpening into the same cold focus she had used the night she corrected the Lisbon contract in the rain. If someone wanted her gone before she found the truth, they would need to try harder than a rumor and a warning note. She intended to stay until she understood everything, no matter how many doors it had taken to arrive at this one, and no matter what it might cost her to keep it open. The following morning brought a storm that matched the one on Aliner's first night at Wren Hollow, though this time the danger was not waiting at the harbor. It was already inside the walls. Aliner arrived at the study to find the door already open, which was unusual, since she was always the first to arrive. She stepped inside carefully and saw immediately that something was wrong. The neat stacks of correspondence she had organized over the past 3 weeks were disturbed. Papers shifted from their careful order. Drawers left slightly open that she always closed the night before. Her heart began to pound as she moved to the desk and checked the hidden compartment where she kept her private notes, the ones tracking the pattern of Charles Gray's visits against the leaked shipping details. The notes were gone. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing through the implications. Whoever had taken them now knew exactly how much she had discovered, and exactly how close she was to proving Charles Gray's involvement. "Julian," she said, her voice tight, when she found him in the breakfast room a few minutes later. "Someone searched the study last night. My notes on Charles are missing." Julian set down his cup slowly, his expression hardening into something Alina had not seen from him before, a controlled fury that made the room feel colder. "Show me." They returned to the study together, and Julian examined the disturbed papers with the careful attention of a man cataloging evidence rather than simply looking at a mess. Whoever did this knew where to look. This wasn't a random search. Which means whoever did this either watched me hide the notes, or already suspected I was keeping them. Or someone told them. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them wanted to acknowledge. Alina thought immediately of Peter Lang, of his coolness toward her since her first day, of the package he had delivered without comment the night before. But suspicion without proof was dangerous, especially in a house where she had already learned that trusted appearances could hide dangerous intentions. "We need to move faster," Julian said. "If Charles knows you're close to proving his involvement, he won't wait to act again. He'll try to discredit you before you can present anything solid, or he'll try something worse." "What could be worse than discrediting me?" Julian did not answer immediately, and his silence told Alina more than words could have. That afternoon, a summons arrived from the county magistrate's office, addressed not to Julian, but to Alina directly. She opened it with unsteady hands, and her stomach dropped as she read the contents. Someone had filed a formal complaint against her, accusing her of forging shipping documents for personal gain, citing her family's reputation as evidence of a pattern of dishonesty. The complaint was detailed, too detailed. It included specific dates and contract numbers that only someone with access to the estate's private correspondence could have known. "They're trying to remove me before I can testify to anything," Alina said, showing the letter to Julian, her voice steadier than she felt. "If I'm branded a forger, nothing I've found will matter. No magistrate will believe evidence gathered by someone already accused of fraud." Julian read the complaint twice, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is Charles's handwriting in disguise. I'd recognize the way he shapes his letters anywhere, no matter how carefully he tries to hide it." "Can you prove that?" "Not easily, but I know someone who can help us prove the rest if we move quickly enough." That evening, Julian called for a meeting with the estate's longtime solicitor, a careful, quiet man named Mr. Whitfield, who had served the Ashcombe family for over 20 years and had no love for Charles Gray, having witnessed the man's ambitions firsthand on more than one occasion. Mr. Whitfield listened to the full account, from the mistranslated Lisbon contract to the leaked Amsterdam correspondence to the missing notes and the sudden complaint against Alina. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The complaint against Miss Vance is a serious problem," he said finally. "But it is also, if I am not mistaken, a mistake on Mr. Gray's part. A man confident in his innocence does not need to remove a witness before she speaks. His urgency reveals more than he intends." "Can we use that?" Julian asked. "We can, if we are careful. I suggest we allow the complaint to proceed to a hearing, rather than fighting to have it dismissed outright. A dismissal raises no questions. A hearing, conducted properly, gives Miss Vance a chance to present her own evidence in a setting where it cannot be quietly buried. Alina felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at the thought of standing before a magistrate. Her family's history laid bare for strangers to judge. The same history that had closed 4 doors before Wren Hollow ever opened one. "They'll ask about my father," she said quietly. "About why we moved so often, about the rumor." "They may," Mr. Whitfield said, not unkindly. "But rumors are not evidence, Miss Vance, and a magistrate worth his position knows the difference, even when a room full of gossiping neighbors does not." Julian reached across the table and, for the first time since she had known him, placed his hand briefly over hers. "You won't stand there alone." Alina looked at him, startled by the simple certainty in his voice, and found that she believed him. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation. Alina and Julian worked late into each night, rebuilding the case from memory, cross-referencing dates and letters, gathering every scrap of evidence that pointed toward Charles Gray's involvement in the leaked contracts. Mr. Whitfield quietly interviewed shipping clerks in Bristol and Amsterdam, gathering statements that confirmed the timing of the leaked information matched Charles's visits with uncomfortable precision. But proving the leaks was not the same as proving who had filed the false complaint against Alina, and without that connection, the hearing risked becoming exactly what Charles intended: a public unraveling of Alina's reputation, with no clear path back to his own guilt. 3 nights before the hearing, Alina could not sleep. She sat by her window, turning her father's recovered brooch over in her hands, thinking of the unsigned warnings that had guided her this far. Whoever had sent them clearly knew more than they had shared. If she could find them, perhaps they could offer the final piece of proof needed to expose Charles Gray publicly. She thought back through every detail of the 2 letters and the package. The handwriting had been careful, deliberately disguised, written by someone educated enough to know French well, but choosing to write in a hand that concealed their natural style. The package containing the brooch had arrived by courier with no return address, but couriers kept records, even when senders tried to remain anonymous. The next morning, before Julian woke, Alina slipped out to the coach house and found the same boy who had come to her door on her first night at Wren Hollow. "Do you remember delivering a courier package to me a week ago? Small, no return address." The boy thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I remember. Odd sort of thing. The man who dropped it at the coaching inn for me to carry didn't want his face seen clearly, kept his collar up despite the warm evening. But I remember his boots. Fine leather, polished, not the sort a common courier wears." "Would you recognize those boots again?" "Maybe, if I saw them close." Alina's mind raced. Fine leather boots suggested someone of standing, someone who could afford quality but wanted to disguise their identity for a simple delivery. It was a small detail, but small details had proven useful before. That evening, during a family dinner that Julian had insisted Charles attend, ostensibly to keep him close and unaware of how much they had already learned, Alina watched Charles Gray's boots beneath the table as he crossed his legs, adjusting his posture with the easy comfort of a man who believed himself entirely safe. Fine leather, polished despite the season, exactly as the boy had described. It was not proof enough to present in a magistrate's hearing, but it confirmed what Alina had begun to suspect. The unsigned warnings had not come from an enemy trying to frighten her away. They had come from Charles Gray himself, or someone very close to him, someone with access to his movements and his conscience, someone who wanted the truth uncovered without risking their own exposure in the process. Perhaps Charles was not the only person in this scheme. Perhaps someone working alongside him had grown uneasy with how far things had gone, uneasy enough to leave a trail of careful warnings for the one person capable of following it. Alina said nothing about her suspicion that evening, choosing instead to watch and wait, aware that whoever had sent those warnings might still be useful, and that revealing her knowledge too soon could put that unknown ally in danger, or silence them entirely before the hearing arrived. The night before the hearing, a final letter arrived, slipped beneath Alina's door sometime after the household had gone quiet. She recognized the disguised handwriting immediately. "Look at the shipping ledger from March," it read. "The one Charles insisted be recopied due to water damage. The original was never damaged. It was destroyed because it proves everything." Alina sat with the letter clutched in her hands, her pulse quick, understanding at last that tomorrow's hearing would decide far more than her own reputation. It would decide whether Julian Ashcombe kept the trade network his father had spent 30 years building, or watched it slip quietly into the hands of a man who had been undermining it from the inside for months, wearing the family name like a disguise of his own. She barely slept that night, running through every argument, every piece of evidence, every question a magistrate might ask, preparing herself for a fight that would require every ounce of the sharp, careful mind that had carried her through every door that had ever closed on her before. The magistrate's chamber was full by the time Alina arrived, every bench crowded with neighbors and merchants curious to witness the downfall of a woman whose name had already traveled ahead of her through 4 households. She kept her chin level and her hands still at her sides, refusing to let the whispers reach her the way they had at every previous door. Julian sat in the front row beside Mr. Whitfield, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in a room built to make her feel small. The magistrate, an older man named Judge Farrow with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics, opened the proceedings by reading the complaint aloud. Forgery, fraud, a pattern of dishonesty allegedly stretching back through Alina's family history. The words landed exactly as intended, drawing murmurs from the crowd, and Alina felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before every door closed. She did not let it show. "Miss Vance," Judge Farrow said, "you may respond to the complaint." Alina rose, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Your Honor, the complaint claims I altered shipping documents for personal gain. I would ask the court to examine the actual documents in question, rather than relying on descriptions provided secondhand." Mr. Whitfield presented the ledgers, and Alina walked the court through each contract methodically, explaining the original wording, the corrected wording, and the reasoning behind every change she had made. She showed the Lisbon contract first, explaining how the mistranslated clause had nearly cost the estate its cargo, and how her correction matched the original intent of both parties exactly. "This does not look like forgery, Your Honor," she said. "It looks like a correction made to prevent a loss that had already been engineered by someone else." A murmur moved through the room. Judge Farrow leaned forward slightly. "Engineered by whom, Miss Vance?" This was the moment Alina had feared and prepared for in equal measure. She glanced once at Julian, who gave the smallest nod, and then she continued. "By Mr. Charles Gray, Your Honor. I believe the evidence will show that the original Lisbon contract was deliberately altered before it reached the harbor, and that similar alterations, along with leaked shipping details, have benefited a rival trading company on at least 3 separate occasions, each time coinciding with Mr. Gray's presence at Wren Hollow." The room erupted into noise. Charles Gray, seated near the back, rose from his chair, his face flushed with a fury he was struggling to control in front of witnesses. "This is absurd," he said. "A translator accused of fraud herself now accuses me. Your Honor, surely you see the desperation in this." "Sit down, Mr. Gray," Judge Farrow said sharply, "or I will have you removed from this chamber." Charles sat, though his jaw remained tight, his eyes fixed on Alina with a coldness that confirmed, more than any document could, exactly how much he had to lose. Mr. Whitfield presented the statements gathered from shipping clerks in Bristol and Amsterdam, each one confirming that leaked details had reached rival companies within days of Charles Gray's documented visits to the estate. The pattern, laid out clearly across a timeline Alina had built from months of careful cross-referencing, left little room for coincidence. And the March shipping ledger, Alina said, producing the final piece of evidence, the one the unsigned letter had guided her toward 2 nights before. Mr. Gray claimed this ledger was damaged by water and had it recopied by hand. I would ask the court to note that the recopied version conveniently omits 3 entries present in a duplicate ledger kept separately by the harbor master. Entries that record Mr. Gray receiving payment from a Bristol trading company on the same dates that leaked shipping information reached that same company. Judge Farrow examined the duplicate ledger Mr. Whitfield had obtained from the harbor master's office, his expression growing sterner with each line. The room had gone quiet now, the earlier murmurs replaced by a tense, waiting silence. "Mr. Gray," Judge Farrow said slowly, "would you care to explain these entries?" Charles's composure finally cracked. The harbor master's records are unreliable. Anyone could have altered them. "By your own admission, then, records can be altered," Judge Farrow said, "which lends considerably more weight to Miss Vance's claim that your original Lisbon contract was altered as well." Charles said nothing, his silence louder than any denial could have been. It was in this silence that a new figure rose from the back of the chamber, someone Alina had not expected to see present at the hearing at all. Peter Lang stepped forward, his face pale but resolved, and asked Judge Farrow for permission to speak. "Your Honor, I have information relevant to this matter." The room turned to look at him, and Alina felt a fresh jolt of uncertainty. Peter had been cool toward her since her first day. She had suspected him more than once of being involved in whatever scheme threatened the estate. Now, watching him step forward voluntarily, she understood, with a rush of clarity, exactly who had been sending the unsigned warnings all along. "I have worked for the Ashcombe family for 6 years, Peter said, his voice unsteady but determined. 3 months ago, Mr. Gray approached me and asked me to share details of the estate's correspondence with him, promising a position in his household once he assumed greater control of the shipping business. I refused at first, but he made it clear that refusal would cost me my position here regardless, since he intended to have influence over the household staff once his plan succeeded." "And did you share those details?" Judge Farrow asked. Peter's eyes flicked briefly to Alina, an apology passing silently between them. "I shared some information early on, before I understood the full scope of what he intended. When I realized how far he meant to take it, I stopped. I could not undo what I had already shared, and I was afraid to come forward directly, afraid of what Mr. Gray might do if he learned I had turned against him. So I sent what warnings I could without revealing myself, hoping Miss Vance was clever enough to follow them." "The brooch," Alina said quietly, understanding fully now. "You knew about my father." "Mr. Gray had you investigated when you were first hired," Peter said. "He found the brooch among records of your father's estate sale, purchased it through an intermediary, thinking it might be useful leverage against you later. I took it before he could use it and sent it to you instead, along with what warning I dared give." The room had gone utterly silent, every eye moving between Peter, Charles, and Alina, the full shape of the scheme finally visible to everyone present. Judge Farrow set down his papers. "Mr. Gray, in light of this testimony, along with the documentary evidence presented by Miss Vance and Mr. Whitfield, I find the complaint against Miss Vance to be without merit, filed in bad faith as an attempt to discredit a witness to your own misconduct. This court will refer the matter of contract fraud and improper solicitation of estate staff to further investigation." Charles rose from his chair, his face pale now instead of flushed, and for a moment Alina thought he might attempt some final protest. Instead, he simply straightened his coat and walked from the chamber without another word, the sound of the door closing behind him, the only response he offered to the ruin of everything he had built in secret. The crowd began to disperse, the earlier hostility toward Alina replaced now by a cautious, curious respect. She remained standing at the front of the chamber, feeling the strange weightlessness of a fight finally won, unsure what to do with hands that had spent 3 days clenched in preparation for a battle now over. Julian crossed the room to her, and for once, he did not maintain the careful, businesslike distance he usually kept in public. "You did that," he said quietly, "all of it." "I had help," Alina said, glancing toward Peter, who stood uncertainly near the back of the chamber, clearly unsure whether he had just saved his position or ended it. Julian followed her gaze and nodded once, a silent understanding passing between the three of them. Whatever punishment or forgiveness Peter's involvement deserved, it was a conversation for later, in private, away from the crowd still filtering out of the chamber with their whispered commentary. For now, Alina allowed herself a single moment of relief, standing in a room that had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not closed its door on her. But as she and Julian stepped outside into the afternoon light, a messenger approached quickly, breathless, holding a letter marked with the seal of the shipping office at the harbor. "Your Grace," the messenger said, "there's been an incident at the docks, a fire aboard one of your ships. They believe it was set deliberately sometime during the night." Julian's face hardened instantly, the relief of the hearing evaporating in an instant. "Which ship?" "The one carrying the Amsterdam cargo, Your Grace. The harbor master says it's a near total loss." Alina felt the cold return to her chest, sharper this time. Charles Grey had left the chamber in silence, but silence, she now understood, was not the same as surrender. The harbor smelled of smoke long before the carriage reached the docks. Alina sat beside Julian, watching the gray haze rise against the afternoon sky, her mind racing through every possible reason Charles Grey might have chosen fire as his final act of retaliation. When they arrived, the scene was worse than the messenger's brief description had suggested. The ship carrying the Amsterdam cargo sat low in the water, its hull scorched black along one side, smoke still curling from the wreckage of what had once been the cargo hold. Dock workers moved frantically along the pier, some hauling buckets of water, others simply standing in stunned silence at the scale of the loss. The harbor master, a broad, weathered man named Osgood, met them at the base of the pier, his face grim. "Started sometime after midnight, Your Grace. One of the night watchmen spotted the smoke and raised the alarm, but by then the fire had already taken hold of the lower deck. We managed to keep it from spreading to the neighboring ships, but this one is finished. Cargo's a total loss, and the hull will need extensive repair before she sails again, if she can be repaired at all." "Any idea how it started?" Julian asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The watchman found broken glass near the origin point, along with the smell of lamp oil far stronger than any lantern could account for. Someone poured accelerant below decks and set it deliberately, Your Grace. This wasn't an accident." Alina's stomach turned as she absorbed the implication. Charles Grey had not simply left the hearing in defeat. He had already set this plan into motion before the ruling was even delivered, perhaps anticipating that the truth would come out and preparing one final act of damage regardless of the outcome. "Was anyone hurt?" Alina asked. "No, miss. Thank the stars for that. The crew had gone ashore for the night, all except the watchman, and he raised the alarm in time to save himself." Small mercy, though it did little to calm the tight knot of fear building in Alina's chest. If the fire had been set with such careless disregard for the ship's cargo and structure, there was no telling what else Charles Grey might attempt now that he had nothing left to lose. "Where is Charles now?" Julian asked, turning to Peter Lang, who had accompanied them to the harbor along with Mr. Whitfield. "I don't know, Your Grace. He left the hearing before any of us. His townhouse in the village has been informed to expect his return, but no one has confirmed he arrived there." "Send word to the magistrate immediately," Julian said. "Judge Farrow needs to know about this fire, and he needs to issue an order for Charles's arrest before he has the chance to disappear entirely." Mr. Whitfield nodded and departed at once toward the magistrate's chamber, leaving Julian, Alina, and Peter standing amid the wreckage and smoke of the ruined ship. "This is my fault," Peter said quietly, staring at the scorched hull. "If I had come forward sooner, none of this would have happened." "You came forward when you found the courage to," Alina said. "Charles Gray chose to set that fire. That choice belongs to him alone." But even as she said it, a colder thought settled over her. Charles had access to information about the estate for months. If he had planned this fire as insurance against the hearing's outcome, what else might he have arranged, quietly in the background, while everyone's attention remained fixed on the courtroom? She turned to Julian. "The other ships, are any of them due to arrive or depart in the next few days?" Julian's face paled slightly as the question registered. "The Danish shipment. It's due to arrive tomorrow morning, carrying nearly half of this quarter's expected revenue." If Charles wanted to cause maximum damage before disappearing, he wouldn't stop at one ship. Julian turned immediately to Osgood. "Double the watch on every vessel in this harbor tonight. No exceptions, and no explanations needed beyond my order." Osgood nodded and hurried off to organize the additional watchmen, shouting instructions to the dock workers as he went. As evening fell, Alina found herself back in the study at Wren Hollow, unable to rest despite the exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. She pored over the estate's remaining shipping schedule, cross-referencing every vessel still at sea or due to arrive against the pattern of Charles Gray's previous sabotage, searching for any vulnerability he might exploit before the magistrate's order for his arrest could be carried out. Julian joined her sometime past midnight, 2 cups of tea in hand, though neither of them had the heart to drink much of it. "You should rest," he said, setting 1 cup near her elbow. "You've been awake since before dawn, and the hearing alone would have exhausted anyone." "I can't rest. Not while he's still out there, and not while there's a chance he means to do more damage before he's caught." Julian sat across from her, watching the careful, focused way she worked through the shipping ledgers, and something in his expression softened into an admiration he had stopped trying to hide days ago. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "The hearing alone cleared your name. You could have stopped there, let the magistrate handle the rest, and none of this would have been asked of you." "I could have," Alina agreed. "But I've spent most of my life watching doors close before I understood why. I'm not interested in walking away from one that's finally open, especially not when walking away means leaving you to face this alone." The words settled between them with a weight neither of them acknowledged directly, though Julian's hand found hers across the desk, steady and warm against the chill that had settled over the study since the news of the fire arrived. "My father used to say that trust was the only currency that mattered in trade," Julian said quietly. "Every contract, every partnership, built on nothing more than 2 people believing the other would hold to their word. I spent years watching Charles smile at every family gathering, never once suspecting he'd spend that trust the way he did." "You couldn't have known." "Perhaps not, but I should have looked closer. I let his charm convince me his ambition was harmless." Julian's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I won't make that mistake again with anyone." Before Alina could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet of the study. Peter Lang entered, breathless, his face tight with urgency. "Your Grace," word from the harbor. "Osgood's watchman caught someone near the Danish ship's mooring, trying to force the cargo hold. They've detained him, but he's demanding to speak with you directly before they hand him to the magistrate." Julian and Alina exchanged a quick glance before rising together, the exhaustion of the day forgotten in the sudden rush of urgency. The harbor at night looked entirely different from the chaos of the morning, quiet now except for the lanterns of the watchmen stationed along the pier and the low murmur of voices near the Danish ship's gangway. As they approached, Alina saw the figure held between 2 watchmen, and her breath caught sharply in her throat. It was not Charles Gray. The man was younger, unfamiliar, dressed in plain clothing that marked him as neither a household servant nor a member of the gentry. He struggled briefly against the watchman's grip before recognizing Julian's approach and going still, his expression shifting into something between defiance and fear. "Who are you?" Julian demanded. "And why were you attempting to board my ship?" The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might refuse to answer entirely. Then Osgood stepped forward, holding out a folded paper he had found on the man during the search. "This was in his coat, Your Grace. Instructions, it looks like, along with payment already received." Julian took the paper and read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. He passed it wordlessly to Alina. The instructions were written in the same disguised hand Alina had seen on the earlier warning letters, though this time the disguise had clearly been an attempt to hide Charles Gray's involvement from someone else entirely, not to warn anyone of danger. The letter offered payment for the destruction of the Danish cargo, to be carried out that same night, regardless of the outcome of any hearing. "He arranged this before the hearing even began," Alina said quietly. "He knew he might lose, and he made certain to cause as much damage as possible either way." The captured man, seeing that his employer's involvement was already exposed, finally spoke, his voice sullen but resigned. "I was paid half in advance, the rest promised once the job was done. I don't know the man who hired me beyond a name, Charles Gray, and a promise that no one would trace the payment back to him." "Where is he now?" Julian asked. "I don't know. He gave me my instructions 3 days ago, told me to wait for word on which night to act. I received that word only this evening, delivered by a boy I didn't recognize." Julian turned to Osgood. "Hold him for the magistrate. He'll answer for this attempt, but Charles Gray is the one who ordered it, and he needs to be found before he can arrange anything further." As the watchman led the man away, Alina stood at the edge of the pier, staring out at the dark water, the lanterns of the harbor reflecting in broken patterns across its surface. Charles Gray had planned for his own defeat, arranging destruction to fall regardless of whether the hearing exposed him. It was the action of a man who valued his revenge more than his own freedom, which made him more dangerous now than he had been even at the height of his scheme. "He'll come after you next," Julian said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "If he's willing to burn a ship and pay a stranger to destroy another, he won't hesitate to target the person who exposed him." "I know. I won't let that happen." Alina turned to face him, the lantern light catching the same steady certainty in his expression that she had noticed the very first night at the harbor, when he had handed her a soaked contract and asked if she could read it. "You can't promise that," she said, "not with Charles still out there." "No," Julian agreed, "but I can promise you won't face it alone, the way you've faced everything else before this." They returned to the manor as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the exhaustion of the past 2 days finally catching up with both of them. But rest would have to wait a little longer, because, as they crossed into the entrance hall, Mrs. Doyle met them with an expression of barely contained alarm. "Your Grace, a letter arrived for Miss Vance while you were at the harbor. I didn't want to disturb you, but given everything happening, I thought you should see it immediately." The letter was unmarked, delivered by hand sometime in the night, and Alina's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The handwriting inside was no longer disguised. It was bold, deliberate, unmistakably Charles Gray's own hand, no longer hiding behind careful strokes meant to obscure his identity. "You cost me everything I built," it read. "A translator with no name, no fortune, no right to stand in rooms meant for people who matter. I will not let you enjoy what you've taken from me. Watch carefully, Miss Vance. I am not finished, and neither is this house's ability to burn." Alina read the letter twice, her hand steady despite the cold dread settling through her chest. She had faced closed doors and cruel whispers for most of her life, had learned to carry rejection without letting it break her stride. But this was different. This was a direct threat, written by a man who had already proven he was willing to burn a ship to make his point. She looked up to find Julian reading over her shoulder, his expression carved from stone. "He's still here," Julian said quietly. "Somewhere close, watching, or he couldn't have known about the letter's timing." "Then we find him before he finds a way to act on this," Alina said, folding the letter carefully, refusing to let her hands shake despite everything her body wanted to do. Julian called for Osgood's watchmen to expand their search beyond the harbor, sending word to every inn and coaching house within a day's ride of Wren Hollow, while Mr. Whitfield worked with the magistrate to formalize the arrest order that would make Charles Gray's capture a matter of law rather than simple pursuit. 3 days passed in tense, careful vigilance. Alina barely left the manor, working alongside Julian to secure every remaining shipment, doubling watches, changing routes at the last moment to avoid any pattern Charles might exploit. Peter Lang, eager to prove his loyalty beyond doubt, volunteered to assist the search efforts personally, riding out each day to check reported sightings that mostly amounted to nothing. On the fourth night, word finally arrived. A coaching in 2 villages away had reported a man matching Charles Gray's description, traveling under a false name, preparing to board a coach bound for the coast at dawn. Julian rode out with Osgood's watchman immediately, refusing to let Alina accompany him despite her insistence, citing the danger of confronting a desperate man in the dark. She spent the night in the study, unable to work, unable to rest, watching the candle burn low as she waited for word. Dawn broke without any messenger, and Alina's fear grew with each passing hour of silence. It was nearly midday before she finally heard the sound of carriage wheels on the drive, and she rushed to the entrance hall to find Julian dismounting, tired but unharmed, with news that settled the weight finally, fully, from her chest. "We caught him," Julian said. "At the inn exactly as reported. He didn't resist, not really. I think in the end he knew there was nowhere left to run." "And the magistrate?" "He'll answer for the fire, for the attempted destruction of the Danish cargo, and for the threat against you. Judge Farrow assured me the evidence is more than sufficient. He won't trouble this house again." Alina felt the tension of the past 4 days finally begin to loosen, though the memory of Charles Gray's letter, the promise that this house's ability to burn was not finished, remained lodged uncomfortably in her mind. She suspected it would be some time before she stopped glancing twice at unfamiliar shadows in the manor's halls. But for now, the immediate danger had passed, and Julian stood before her in the entrance hall, exhaustion and relief mingling openly on his face in a way she had never seen him allow in front of the household staff before. "Wren Hollow is safe," he said, "because of you." "Because of both of us," Alina corrected gently. "And Peter and Mr. Whitfield, and even Osgood's stubborn insistence on doubling every watch you asked for." Julian allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one Alina had seen from him since the fire. "Perhaps, but it was you who read that first contract in the rain and refused to walk away when every reasonable instinct might have told you to leave well enough alone." "I've had enough doors close on me to know the value of one that finally opens," Alina said. "I wasn't about to let anyone close this one, not without a fight." In the weeks that followed, as the estate settled back into its ordinary rhythm, and the damaged ship was slowly repaired under Osgood's careful supervision, Alina remained at Wren Hollow, no longer simply a translator buried in unread correspondence, but a trusted partner in every decision Julian made regarding the estate's future. The household staff, who had once looked away from her at meals, now greeted her with the quiet respect earned by someone who had faced down a scandal and a saboteur alike without losing her composure. Peter Lang remained on staff as well, his early mistake forgiven in light of the courage it had ultimately taken to come forward, and Julian made certain the boy from the coach house, who had first fetched Alina into the storm and later remembered a stranger's fine leather boots, received a proper position, and a generous wage for services that had mattered more than he likely understood. Late one evening, months after the fire, Alina sat in the study that had once overwhelmed her with its chaos, now organized and quiet, working through a new shipment of letters with the same careful, practiced speed she had brought on her very first day. Julian entered, as he often did now, not with urgent business, but simply to sit across from her, the comfortable silence between them filled with something neither of them needed to name aloud. "You know," he said eventually, "when I hired you that night at the harbor, I only wanted someone who could read a contract. And now I find myself unable to imagine this house, or this life, without you in it." Alina set down her pen, meeting his eyes across the desk that had once held nothing but unread chaos, and found that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not waiting for the moment when he would change his mind. Some doors, once they finally opened, stayed open, and Alina Vance, who had spent her whole life learning the shape of rejection, had finally found the one place willing to let her stay.